I'm going to talk about a more global perspective or a measurement of global hunger, which is called the Global Hunger Index. So the Global Hunger Index is a measure of food insecurity, which discusses factors like malnourishment, child wasting, child stunting, and child mortality, and basically combines these into a number ranging from 0 to 100, where lower numbers are correlated with a lower prevalence of hunger, and higher numbers are correlated with a higher prevalence of hunger. This has some flaws. As you can see, places like the US, Canada, and Western Europe, they don't have any data because they have like a very low prevalence of hunger. And also, even if a country does have a low prevalence of hunger, it doesn't mean that there aren't problems. So like it doesn't really address like food deserts or anything like that. Anyway, in front of us here, we have the Global Hunger Index of a bunch of countries in 2012. So we're going to take a look at 2019's map later, but just take a look at this map and see especially like Asia and African countries. All right, we can move on to the next slide then. So this is the 2019's Global Hunger Index. And yeah, take a look at this too. Again, in the same areas, Asia and Africa. All right, you can move to the next slide again. So what trends do you see? Just think about it for a little bit. But right away, hopefully you were able to see that a bunch of countries like India, China, and a bunch of African countries also, they improved the global hunger index over like the past couple of years. And although COVID might have made it, yeah, it mostly got better. Although COVID might have hindered it now, it has gotten better, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. So how did a bunch of countries improve their global hunger index? Well, a lot of this stuff is listed here. Elevating people above the poverty line really helps a lot. Increasing the rates of formal and reproductive education, producing higher amounts of more nutritious food rather than like a lot of quantity, practicing sustainable agricultural practices, and providing better access to healthcare all improve this global hunger index. And over here is a little graphic that just shows it. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, there's one more slide. Yeah. So even though it has improved due to COVID, there's still like a lot of problems, and there's still like even more problems with food security in 2020. Obviously, COVID has like a huge impact on this. It's destroyed supply chains, and there's a lot of job insecurity and increased prevalence of poverty. Speaking about poverty, there's a cycle between hunger and poverty, where if you're hungry and you don't get access to nutritious food a lot, you might not be able to function as well, and that might cause you to fall into poverty. Political instability, conflict, and ineffective government response all play into these supply chains. And so having like diminished responses can cause lower or can cause more damaged supply chain and greater prevalence of food insecurity. Climate change also has a huge impact on it. Lower precipitation rates and droughts, reduced agricultural yields. And one thing that has been mentioned and isn't very commonly known is that right now some of the worst locust outbreaks are going on. Yeah.
I can take it from here, Sabrisha, if you want to. So we're thinking about like food and food supply, but we have to also acknowledge where food comes from. And you can just think this to yourself, like, how do you think COVID has influenced food supply and insecurity? And obviously, like, as you can guess, it hasn't influenced it in a positive way. If you can go to the next slide, Maria, that'd be great. Yeah, so we're talking about how like food deserts and access to food has been decreased, but also like on the other end, the workers who are like harvesting our food or packaging our food are also incredibly affected by COVID. And I know a lot of you have seen the picture on social media of migrant workers or local workers in California and Oregon where the wildfires have been raging. they're still collecting our food. And so like this concept of exploitation and just really crappy like labor laws, because the people who are collecting our food, like migrant workers, aren't getting health insurance, aren't getting sick leave, but yet they're working during a pandemic and literal wildfires. In addition, I was looking at like processing plants, and I think one of the really interesting ones was like the meatpacking industry, and how so many cases are tied to these packing industries, these plants, but then local laws are trying to prevent more workers going back to work, but then like the government decides to issue an executive order to keep meat processing plants open. And I think I was reading a couple articles about this, and there's a really interesting quote of social distancing is a nicety that only makes sense for people with laptops. And people with laptops aren't typically the ones who are already marginalized or working in extreme conditions. The same people who are getting exploited and taken advantage of, that are in even worse positions because of COVID. And I think this is like really evident in the food supply chain. And so like even if once you move past that, like your food's harvested in these extreme conditions, but then it has to be like processed and moved. And so then like after that you have to have supermarkets putting your stuff on shelves. And like I think in the group chat with Noah said, like dumping product. I think that's absolutely insane. When there's so many people who are suffering from food insecurities. And I think I also included a couple links in the resources section after our little PowerPoint's over, of like different podcasts and more of like a first person voice of their own struggles during this time. So I think we can go on to the next slide.
All right, here's my section. So I wanted to look more into the why behind food insecurity and how it affects the people themselves. So typically with communities, you have two separate types. You've got your big cities and you have the rural areas. And something that I found very interesting about the dichotomy between the two is that rural areas, despite being the ones who actually grow our food, who make it and then send it to us, actually tend to face higher levels of food insecurity than even big cities do. I then looked at like, okay, well, why might that be? And a huge part of this is actually because of the environment itself. So as we've already talked about, climate change is making huge effects on how we can make our food and distribute it. So like, you know, the wildfires, the droughts and the famines. And then another part of that is actually conflict. So typically what militaries do is that they target civilians. And then when they target civilians, what they often do afterwards is they actually take their land and they try to make it as infertile as possible. So that way that land cannot be used by anyone else. So despite like all the bombs being dropped and having landmines in there, you add on to this that now they're actually like actively trying to make the land as unusable as possible for future agricultural purposes. So people literally cannot fight back and they literally starve them out, which is not only a really huge human rights violation, but has very long impacts in terms of future development for that country, even when the conflict is over. And then just among individuals, like demographic factors, we've noticed that race, ethnicity, family size, education level, disability is a very big one, and income level are very big when it comes to determining who is going to be the most insecure for food among us. And I found that very interesting because you see where these intersections all come in. And then, of course, we have economic factors. So as we talked about before, there tends to be more food insecurity in areas where there's less income growth, there's less job opportunities, and it's not like a coincidence. It's not at all. It's a very deliberate thing, and we need to fight against this for sure. All right, go ahead and move on.
Okay, thank you, Abigail. So for breakout session 2, what we are going to be doing is the internal has kind of mocked up scenarios based on articles that we found and other scenarios that we found online. And we are going to break you into your original breakout rooms and I think just discussing the scenario and answering some of the questions that we've sprinkled in, and just talking about the situation is what we intend for you guys to do. So yeah, and please make sure to assign somebody to share back to the main group or just take some notes on the situation here.
And either Jonathan or Anish, if you want to drop the link to the breakout room doc again, just in case anybody closed out of it.